Hello, class. Welcome to the second half of our discussion of New France. We're going to be carrying on from our discussion from last lecture and finishing off an early historical overview of the period of post-contact New France settlement. And it's just another reminder about your quiz on Tuesday. If you're watching this on Monday morning, September 28th, your quiz is tomorrow during class time. There's information regarding the quiz posted in the announcements. It's also will be posted in the announcement that you read this morning as well. There's another reminder you have until the end of each Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. Pacific Standard Time to do your audio and form responses. And just another reminder, you get a full week to do it. So you have a full week from each Wednesday to answer the question. I recommend answering it a little bit before the Tuesday prior because you're going to have it's going to be pretty distant to you from you at that point. Just a quick note about the rest of the recordings. I recorded the entire slideshow and then realized that I was recording on an inferior microphone and the voice quality is not as great for the rest of the slides. So I do apologize for that as well, but it's definitely still, you can definitely still hear it. It just sounds a little bit more metallic-y, and if you're having any problems listening or if you're having any problems hearing anything, please send me an email and I'll look to fix it. If you're having any problems with any of the part of the course so far, please send me an email or come and see me during office hours, which again, as I want to stress, are not mandatory. They're just if you have questions. They're each Wednesday from 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. All right, let's begin our discussion of New France. Let's begin by discussing Acadia, something that we briefly discussed last lecture. A half-century would pass between Cartier's kidnappings of Aboriginal men along the St. Lawrence and the arrival of French delegations determined to build a sustained presence. And if you remember our discussion of this period and the Cartier's party, the kidnapping of Donnacona from the Stadacona settlement, you recall that the original parties that arrived were not perhaps equipped for long-term settlement. The second Cartier party that did arrive was a little heftier, a little more prepared. But it'd be much later, a half century, 50 years, in fact, before serious French attempts to create permanent settlements would arrive in the region. Not surprisingly, they would do so first in the lands closest to Europe and near the riches of the Grand Banks fisheries. Recall the description of the fishes that were so plentiful that you could walk across them, if you recall, from our discussion last week. This territory would become known as Acadia, and we briefly discussed Acadia last week. And again, you might have some knowledge of Acadian history. You may yourself know an Acadian person, be Acadian. There's a long, rich history of Acadians in Canada, especially in the Maritimes, and it exists to this day. It's definitely one of Canada's most historically preserved areas. If you've ever had a chance to visit out there, I highly recommend it. It's beautiful, especially in the summertime. And we're going to be discussing Acadian history, a large part throughout this semester, involving not just the settlement, but also later on with the Acadian expulsions. We won't get ahead of ourselves too far as that comes in the 18th century, but just keep that in mind that our discussion of Acadia will not end today. We will also address a reoccurring theme that has sort of touched a lot of the aspects of the course so far, and that is this lack of homogeneity within the territories of Canada, whether that is among Indigenous peoples or whether that is among settler populations. These are not homogeneous situations. These are not situations in which everyone agrees on all aspects of how to govern new territories, how to peaceably enforce laws, how to, in some senses, practice religions. And we're going to talk about that today. With the dawn of the Acadian Civil War. In 1640, a civil war broke out in Acadia over which French governor would rule the colony, the new colony. The two sides were divided by those based in the Port Royal area and loyal to Governor Charles de Menou d'Aulnay de Charnisay. I'm so sorry to any of you who speak French. Let me just, first of all, put that out there right now. I am just sorry about my horrifying French. If you do speak French, I apologize to your language and to your linguistic ancestors. I am so very sorry. I will do my very best to pronounce these as best as I can. And I'll also do my best to just avoid having to do large sections of French pronunciation for you. But I'm just sorry about that in general. And those attached to the settlement at the mouth of the Saint Jean River and affiliated with the Protestant governor, Charles de Saint-Étienne de la Tour. Now, what is important about this aspect of the Civil War? Why are we focusing on it? Well, number one, it is pretty important to distinctly point out the fact that inside of French settler settlements, we have division, we have disagreement, we have conflict. Well, as far back as the 17th century, this is not a French-English sort of, this is not a French versus English situation. This is an inter-French struggle. And it's based in religion. And it's based in which vision of New France was going to emerge. Whose idea for New France was to be privileged over another. So you see here, in Acadia, there was this division between trying to establish firm Catholic roots and firm Protestant roots resulted in a civil war in 1640. Now, this is an extremely important thing to remember when we discuss the larger themes in Canadian history. But again, it's important to remember that the lack of homogeneity that we discussed among indigenous peoples is also true in settler populations, even among French populations, which I think sometimes the temptation when you're studying Canadian history is to just assume that there's the English and that there's the French, right? Their English interests are loyal to England and those are loyal to France. Well, inside of both of those regions, you have sharp disagreements and even bloody disagreements about the way in which Canada, or what would become Canada, would evolve. So that's important. 1640, there's a civil war among Acadians between basically who was loyal to a Protestant governor and who was loyal to a Catholic governor. This brings us to another important theme that we're going to be discussing throughout this course, which is the Indigenous alliances with settler conflict and inside of settler conflicts. This long, protracted struggle involved the local Indigenous populations as well. The Wabanaki Confederacy grafted the Acadians onto their lives and struggles. Faced with the aggressive British settlements in New England, the Confederacy accepted French fortifications and support. So again, remember we discussed this sort of litany of various military and economic alliances that existed inside of Indigenous communities, including the Iron Confederacy, the Council of Three Fires, and all of those various groups. The point there was to discuss how complex this world was and how important cooperation was. Well, the Wabanaki alliances and allegiances with the French settlers at this point was an important part of the way this period in Canadian history played out as well. Mostly because, again, the temptation is to assume conflict between Indigenous and settler communities, but you have to also understand that in certain moments, cooperation was possible and also necessary for both groups to survive. The Wabanaki preferred the French over the English precisely because the French posed fewer threats for several reasons. First, the number of French in Acadia was never as great or as worrisome as the number of English to the south. Now, when we say the south here, you can imagine the New England settlements in the United States. You can picture in your heads, I think, what those settlements started to look like in Maine and in what would become Connecticut and Massachusetts, I should say. And you can see that the more established English settlements in the south were starting to become fortified. But again, recall what we talked about when we discussed New France, right? We discussed it as a zone of influence, right? It's this massive chunk of territory. French settlement tears off across the North American continent and it stretches itself very, very, very thin. It doesn't center its power. It doesn't concentrate itself in any one zone specifically. Port Royal is an example of maybe a concentrated French settlement, but aside from that, you don't have as many really concentrated areas of French settlement in North America during this point, which means for the French to survive, they're going to need help. They're going to need help feeding themselves. They're going to need help protecting themselves from each other in some senses, from other indigenous groups, and also from the English as well. Enter the Wabanaki allegiances. Now, this is something that's very important during the history of these communities because, as you'll see, as the centuries roll on in the pre-Confederation era, conflict after conflict arise between French and between English, and indigenous alliances become extremely important to winning these conflicts and to surviving afterwards. And the second reason that the Wabanaki chose the Acadians to sort of align themselves with and ultimately fight battles with is the fact that the Acadian community intermarried extensively. And while populations merged, so did cultures. And by the late 17th century, there were many Catholic Mi'kmaq, perhaps as many as there were Catholic French Acadians. So these groups were not becoming two distinct societies, they were becoming closer and closer to being a large zone of intermixing here. And you can see here from this map that's from the textbook from 4.2, This is a description, and again, the shaded green. I'm not going to be asking you to label a map like this. This is, again, just to illustrate the points of connection here. But you see the ancestral territories of the Mi'kmaq, and you can see there are many territories in this map here that overlap with settler populations and settler settlements from French and English. Of course, that makes sense. That's the territories that were theirs to begin with. Of course, the other way of phrasing that would be that settlers arrived in their ancestral territory and essentially never left. But it's no secret as to why these groups would be intermarrying and sharing cultures and evolving over the course of centuries as one people. I mean, this is an area of the country where, again, cooperation is extremely important towards survival in terms of getting through the winter. And as described through Cartier's first arrivals, it is at least possible in some of these regions for mutualistic benefit for indigenous groups and settler groups as well. Not to say that it happened all the time, and not to say that, for instance, for all Mi'kmaq, that it benefited them equally. It's just to say that there is a multiplicity of experiences during this contact and post-contact era. So again, the allegiance between the Wabanaki Alliance and the Acadians makes a lot of sense, right? So remember, the demographics are starting to shift. They're starting to become a mixture of the two cultures, and also the French desperately needed help in this region from a local group that could give them manpower and give them the resources they needed to survive the winters. Now we move towards understanding how the economy of New France operated. And there's a really important reason that we're gonna focus on this, and it might even be something that you're relatively familiar with from grade school. Though again, I'm not always entirely sure where everyone is obviously from educationally, so I'm not going to presuppose any prior knowledge of the fur trade or anything like that. But if you went to school in Canada, it is often possible that you would have come across some brief overview of the fur trade or explorer history. So again, if I'm telling you something you already know, I'm so sorry. The economic development of New France was based on two staple commodities of the time. During the 16th and early 17th centuries, it was dominated by the Atlantic fisheries. Again, think back to Cartier's arrival and the description of fish so plentiful you could walk across. And during the latter half, I should say, of the 17th and 18th centuries, as French settlement penetrated farther into the continental interior, it was dominated by the fur trade. So essentially, in the 300 years we're talking about here, 1600 or 1500 to 1600, 1600 to 1700, and then 1700 to 1800, you can see an evolution in the economic development of New France, beginning with fisheries. It makes sense. You've arrived in the waters. You remember being there. It's an easy resource to extract quickly. And then the farther that, and again, if you picture those maps of New France, you remember how far west and south and even north that New France extended into. You can see that the interior economy being centered around the fur trade just makes sense intuitively just by looking at a map. So perhaps we are again familiar with how the fur trade operated, but I think from this point we're going to sort of go back to where we were a little bit earlier, describing what it was like for people of New France to earn money and what these economies looked like and what the people who participated in the economies, what their lives were like. So let's discuss the demands of the fur trade, what it would have been like to work at the fur trade, what were the jobs like, and what kinds of people worked in these jobs, and what were the sort of cultural implications of the fur trade. So again, brief summary, contact occurs in the 15th and 16th centuries in North America, and by the early 1600s, trade had developed between the French and the Algonquins of the St. Lawrence region. Once disease and war drove the Hurons out of the fur trade, their place was taken by independent workers who delivered furs to New France. These men were known as the coureurs du bois, which roughly means the runners of the woods. And the coureurs du bois gained a unique place in Canadian lore. They developed strong relationships with indigenous peoples as they depended on their assistance to obtain and to sell furs. They had a transient lifestyle, I think would be the best way to describe, and developed a steady reputation for heavy drinking and boisterous singing. This is this portrait here of a coureur du bois gentleman with this unbelievably amazing beard and fantastic hat, holding this rifle and these snowshoes and this awesome dog. This is essentially the coureur du bois archetype summarize. This is what they pictured, these men that would go off into the woods, obtain the furs, and then sell them at trading posts. These men were independent contractors as well, and that's sort of an economic distinction. But they did not have necessarily bosses in the same way that we associate other workers with the voyageurs, for instance. Coureurs du Bois were their own sort of people. But it developed this privileging of a certain type of masculinity known as bush masculinity. And bush masculinity is a sense of manliness determined by survival and physical work skills, influencing relationships with women and other men. And it's one of the most influential cultural artifacts of this period in Canadian history, and it lasts for centuries afterwards, up until today. It's something that I think has not really left Canadian culture in general and writ large. I think bush masculinity is something that we're going to be talking about a great deal throughout this semester, but this is the origins of it. This sort of authentic existence in New France, as if you were a man who were able to obtain furs yourself and go off in the woods and live solitary existences. This was sort of the peak of what it meant to be a man in New France. Now, again, in some senses, these archetypes have lingered for centuries afterwards and have had some senses negative consequences on the way that Canadian masculinity has evolved, and something that we're going to talk about briefly, probably towards the end of class as well. But again, this is the sort of historical basis of it. This is the historical period in which you see these occupations actually exist. And I want you to think about the implications of this distant period in history too. We're talking about something that's centuries and centuries and centuries ago. And yet many Canadians, I think, still feel a connection to this type of masculinity today. So now we've learned about the sort of character of these early men in New France and the sort of reputation that they held, but it's not going to be a very fruitful new colony. It's not going to be a very successful one if it's just a bunch of men running around in the woods looking to obtain furs. There needs to be some sort of sense of stability and family unit, and for that you need females, right? You need women to produce families, obviously, and to create communities in this region. So what to do, right? So how do we get these new colonies to be filled with human beings? How do we do this? Roughly 800 women, most of them young, were sent out from France at the crown's expense between 1663 and 1673. The plan was to marry them off to men of the regiment and anyone else who might be thereby be encouraged to settle down, raise a farm and a family, and become a permanent part of Canadian life. Again, note that it's going to be Canadien with an E, means French Canadian. Just always be careful of that on the slide. It's just an easier way of saying French Canadian. Now, these women were known as the Filles du Roi, roughly meaning the daughters of the king. Okay, so again, not to impose 21st century standards on the 17th century, but I think that is somewhat of a nasty enterprise, sending off 800 women. And let's take a look at the age here, as you can see on this graph on the bottom left-hand part of your slide. 57% of them were 16 to 25. 22% were 26 years and older, which was actually fairly, and there's Belshaw gets into detail about this a little bit more in the textbook. It's actually really interesting that he discusses the sort of marriage age question. But anyway, so almost a quarter of the daughters of the king were 26 years or older. The 11% of them unknown. That's obviously understandable given how far back this is, but then there is this uncomfortable slice, which is 10%, or aged 12 to 15. And that is obviously something that I think in our modern sensibilities we would say, yikes, that is extremely young to be sending someone that far away from home in those kinds of conditions with very little skills to equip themselves at such a young age. Now again, you might the temptation is to gasp and be horrified by such an exercise, and essentially there is a pretty strong case to be made that this is essentially human trafficking in your own country. But such was the way in which colonial enterprises were built. Such is the nature of colonialism as a practice. This is something that makes sense in terms of if your goal is to create lasting settlements, you're going to need to create settlements out of thin air, essentially, and this is a way of doing it. So the Filles du Roi are a really sort of an oddity, historical oddity certainly, but again, there's a practical dimension to this as well. But once these families were being formed in farms and regiment barracks and all across New France. And again, it's important to remember that first map of New France that we looked at and how different the territory was. I mean, imagine you could be settling in Nova Scotia. You could be settling in what is essentially eastern Ontario. You could be settling as far south as Florida and everything in between. So you really might not know what you're getting into, and your experiences are going to be very, very difficult. But for those who lived in the New France of what is modern day Canada, especially on the East Coast right now, life was incredibly harsh for these new families, constantly under threat of attack from the environment and from enemies in the region. Think to the Acadian Civil War as an example of this. Importantly, these women were equal partners in the process of colonization. It was a necessity. So this is not a story of men essentially dragging settlements into being out of their own two hands. They were equal partners in the colonizing process. And I think we have different feelings about what that means today, and that almost sounds like equal culpability. But it is important to remember that in this sense, women were a part of this enterprise. They were an extremely important part. In fact, they were an integral part, if not the most integral part, as there are no colonies without families in this region. And to go through what they would have had to have gone through would have been absolutely impossible to fathom how tricky that would have been to navigate for those poor young women. So again, it answers a very obvious question about biologically how did the colonies of New France survive, but the practicality and the ruthlessness of it is something I think that in modern eyes it can be a little surprising to hear that France would just wound up 800 women and send them in boats, some of which died on the journey and some of which didn't make it very long after arriving. You can see that this is a very, very different sort of attitude towards certainly the lives of settlers in general, but of the lives of women as and their roles in the colonial project of this period. We will finish with a discussion of the seigneurial system, a sort of system of social organization and an economic class structure that was integral to the organization of New France. And the key elements of the seigneurial system include the personnel and their roles, the land use pattern involved, and the ways in which the system integrated into the rest of the economy. And this is something that Belshot in 4.6 gets into great detail, and I encourage you to read that section more thoroughly to get a better sense of what this system was. But just generally speaking, seigneurs occupied a position similar to that of what the French nobility, both with regard to their peasantry and to the king, for whom they had to swear an oath of loyalty. These seigneurs were granted large tracts of land along the river systems of the colonies. So they were essentially given these lands, politically appointed large tracts of land, out of which they had to carve their own farm or domain. They had to provide common land and long, narrow strips of land stretching back from the riverfront for the censetiers or habitants. And the habitant is the term that we're going to focus on there. Those who lived on the land and those who worked on the land itself. It's an aspect that we're going to talk about in more detail a little bit later. But again, the social class structure here started to evolve very similarly to the way it did in France at the time. So these higher ranking nobility would be granted large parcels of land from the early French colonial governments. They would then hire people to live on the land and till the land and make it and essentially farm the land as well. And these people had to live on in through very difficult conditions. These habitants, these people who lived on seigneurial plots, were sort of, this is something similar to serfdom. It is not quite serfdom, but we're sort of in that ballpark for sure. But the habitants become an extremely important part of French-Canadian identity centuries later. The habitants are still to this day carry a large piece of French cultural memory, French cultural cachet, certainly, as the habitant is the nickname for the Montreal Canadiens, so the Habs. That's where this comes from. But there's, just to give you an example there, it's a strange connection to make 500 years back in history, 400 years back in history. Go back and say, yes, our hockey team is going to be named after the rent-paying land users of the seigneurial system in early New France in Canada. You can see that there must be something else other than simply a love of history, which I'm sure all French Canadian hockey fans love history, but there must be some other reason that they would choose this nickname for their team. And goes back to this idea of what was a New France man and what was the bush masculinity expected of these men. So again, the takeaway points from today are, again, this drawing home again the need for indigenous alliances in this period, the Wabanakis being a great example, aligning themselves with Acadians, and Acadians, who are this period or parcel of New France named Acadia, as we discussed in the first slide. The people that lived there began to intermarry and intermingle, and these cultures began to develop along together. And the Wabanakis became important military and cultural allies with early Canadian settlement. We also talked about the Coureurs du Bois, the runners of the woods, and what they did, and they went off into the woods and procured furs and then sold them at trading posts, and this sort of emergence of bush masculinity, which came from these people as well. The Filles du Roi, the daughters of the king, this sort of need to create stable family structures in early New France. Obviously, that's an important part of this discussion as well. And then finally, this sort of land-based system, which 4.6 in Belshai gets in even more detail about, that include the seigneurs and the habitants, the seigneurial system in general. All right, well, that summarizes it for this week, and this finishes our early discussion of New France. We'll be returning to discussions of New France frequently, but this is sort of the historical overview of New France in the post-contact era. Thank you for listening.